Your favorite team is in control of a crucial match. They're passing the ball around the back, managing the game well. But then, one bad pass, a miscommunication. The defender plays it straight into his own net. An avoidable own goal. The momentum shifts, and suddenly, what should have been a controlled win turns into a disaster. That's exactly what Brexit was for Britain. A decision made with confidence, expected to bring control and prosperity, only to backfire spectacularly. The UK is the only G7 nation still struggling to regain its pre-pandemic economic levels. Trade has become more expensive, businesses are drowning in red tape, and labour shortages are crippling key industries. Without access to the EU single market, Britain is facing barriers it never had to deal with before. Meanwhile, other major economies have rebounded, adapting to global challenges while the UK remains stuck in uncertainty. Instead of the economic revival Brexit was meant to bring, Britain is dealing with the consequences of being on the outside, without the benefits it once had inside the EU. So, how exactly did Brexit backfire so spectacularly? And why is Britain still paying the price? Let's break it all down.
No longer will British officials be marching into buildings like this to have their say over day-to-day business or future policy of the European Union.
On January 31st, 2020, the UK officially left the European Union, becoming the first country ever to do so. Supporters promised freedom from EU regulations, tighter border controls, and new global trade opportunities. But 5 years later, the results tell a very different story. A weaker economy, sluggish trade, and crippling uncertainty. The reality is that Brexit didn't just hurt Britain, it backfired spectacularly. Let's start with the economy. Before Brexit, the UK was one of the fastest growing economies in the G7. Today, it's the only G7 nation that still hasn't returned to its pre-pandemic GDP levels. While EU nations benefited from recovery programs like the €750 billion Next Generation EU Fund, Britain was left to navigate post-pandemic challenges alone. Then there's business investment, or rather the lack of it. Since the Brexit referendum in 2016, foreign direct investment, or FDI, into the UK has dropped by 37%. Why? Because companies no longer see Britain as an easy gateway to the EU. Instead, they're setting up shops in places like Germany, France, and the Netherlands, where they can trade freely without customs headaches. In fact, according to a 2023 analysis by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, UK business investment could have been 12.4% higher if Brexit had never happened. Another massive Brexit own goal? Labour shortages. Before Brexit, businesses could easily hire workers from the EU. But when freedom of movement ended, so did that labour pipeline. The country's reliance on EU workers, particularly in industries like agriculture, healthcare, and hospitality, was drastically underestimated. The end of free movement meant businesses suddenly had to navigate a complex and restrictive visa system, leading to chronic labour shortages. In the agriculture sector, farms are struggling to find workers, leaving crops to rot in the fields. In healthcare, the NHS is short on nurses and doctors who once came from the EU, whereas in hospitality and construction, particularly, the restaurants, hotels, and building projects are facing major staffing gaps. Brexit supporters argued that restricting EU migration would push wages up for British workers, but in reality, businesses struggled to fill positions, and many were forced to cut hours, scale back operations, or even shut down completely. The economic cost of these labour shortages have been estimated in the billions. One of the biggest reasons Brexit has hurt Britain? Uncertainty. From 2016 to 2020, businesses had no idea what Brexit would look like. Would there be a trade deal? Would the UK stay aligned with EU rules? That uncertainty froze investment. Even today, 5 years after Brexit became official, companies remain hesitant. The Bank of England's Decision Maker Panel, or DMP, survey found that since 2016, at least 30% of firms have consistently ranked Brexit as a top concern, peaking at 55% in 2020. Even now, businesses fear that further regulatory divergence from the EU could make things even worse. Unlike external shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic or the Russia-Ukraine war, Brexit is entirely self-inflicted, and unlike those crises, its damage isn't temporary. Britain's decision to leave the EU was framed as a bold step towards sovereignty and economic revival. But as the dust settled, the real-world consequences of this historic move began to unfold. Promises of frictionless trade and newfound global opportunities clashed with the reality of supply chain disruptions, labour shortages, and rising costs. So, what went wrong? Let's break down how Brexit's ripple effect sent shockwaves through the UK's trade and investments. Brexit was supposed to be about taking back control, but instead, it turned into what many call the own goal of the century. Far from boosting Britain's economy, The split from the European Union unleashed a series of unintended consequences that have reshaped trade and business in ways few anticipated. Let's start with the numbers. The UK's goods trade has taken a serious hit. Since leaving the EU Single Market and Customs Union on January 1st, 2021, exports to the EU have struggled to recover. Estimates suggest that UK goods exports are anywhere from 6% to a staggering 30% lower than they would have been had Brexit never happened. While the government avoided tariffs by securing a free trade deal, it wasn't enough to prevent the damage. So, what went wrong? It all comes down to non-tariff barriers, the mountain of new paperwork, border delays, and customs checks that businesses now face when trading with the EU. For large corporations with dedicated logistics teams, these obstacles were a headache, but for small businesses, they were a knockout punch. Many simply gave up on EU trade altogether. In fact, surveys show that over 14,000 small firms stopped trading with EU nations in the first 2 years alone. That's not just lost revenue, that's jobs, investment, and opportunities that vanished overnight. And while the UK government has been quick to highlight new trade deals with countries like Australia and New Zealand, their economic impact is a drop in the ocean compared to the losses from Brexit. And it's not just UK businesses that felt the pain. Spain saw a 7% increase in firms halting exports to the UK. France and Germany, Britain's key trading partners, witnessed their trade performance slipping below global averages. Even outside the EU, Brexit's ripples reached America and China, complicating long-standing trade relationships. Who won? Who lost? While the UK grapples with these post-Brexit realities, some countries have profited from Britain's misstep. Ireland, in particular, emerged as an unexpected winner. As businesses sought to maintain access to the EU market, many shifted operations to Dublin, driving a 90% increase in customs revenue for Ireland. Meanwhile, France and Belgium saw ports like Dunkirk and Zeebrugge boom, as trade that once flowed seamlessly through the UK was rerouted. Even Germany, despite suffering some setbacks, has managed to offset losses by strengthening trade ties with other EU partners. And then there's the global trade map. Countries like the US and China, once heavily invested in Britain as a gateway to Europe, have had to rethink their strategies. Many American companies have moved their European headquarters to Ireland or Germany, sidestepping the UK entirely. Chinese firms, once bullish on Britain, are now taking a more cautious approach, wary of Brexit's long-term economic implications. 5 years after Brexit became a reality, the evidence is clear. The UK shot itself in the foot. The dream of economic independence has been overshadowed by lost trade, a shrinking workforce, and an economy that is 4% smaller than it otherwise would have been. While the government continues to chase new trade deals and adapt to its post-Brexit reality, one question remains: was it worth it? With businesses struggling, industries reeling, and an economic growth slowing, the long-term impact of Brexit became impossible to ignore. What was once sold as a triumph of independence started to look like a self-inflicted wound. Public sentiment shifted, and even some of Brexit's most vocal supporters began to question whether the UK had scored one of the greatest own goals in modern history. So, how did Brexit backfire? And why do so many regret it now? Let's examine. When Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, the promise was clear: stronger borders, economic freedom, and a weekly £350 million boost for the NHS. Fast forward 8 years, and for many Brits, Brexit hasn't just failed, it's backfired spectacularly. Today, poll after poll tells the same story. Regret is growing, even among those who voted to leave. A recent YouGov survey reveals that 62% of Britons now see Brexit as a failure. More strikingly, if a new referendum were held today, the numbers would flip. 59% would choose to rejoin the EU compared to just 41% who would stay out. So, why do so many feel Brexit was a mistake? Let's start with the economy. Brexit was supposed to strengthen Britain's financial position, but instead, it's fueled inflation and a cost of living crisis. 63% of Brits blame Brexit for rising prices, while only 7% think it has helped curb inflation. And those NHS promises? A mere 9% believe Brexit has benefited healthcare, while nearly half say it's made things worse. Trade hasn't fared any better. 49% of Britons say Brexit has harmed UK businesses' ability to import goods, while only 15% see any benefit. Meanwhile, farmers and small businesses, many of whom supported Brexit, now find themselves struggling with higher costs and reduced subsidies. And then there's immigration, the core issue that fueled the Leave campaign. Brexit was meant to give Britain full control over its borders, yet today, 53% of Leave voters say the government has mishandled immigration. The reality? Net migration reached record highs in 2023, proving that leaving the EU didn't solve the problem. It made it harder to manage. Beyond the economy, Brexit has also thrown British politics into chaos. Since the 2016 referendum, Britain has cycled through 5 prime ministers in just 8 years, each struggling to deal with Brexit's fallout. The Conservative Party, once united under the slogan "Get Brexit Done," is now facing a massive voter exodus. Former Leave voters are shifting towards the Reform Party, while Remainers, vindicated by Brexit's failures, are rallying behind Labour. Despite widespread regret, there's little political appetite to reopen the Brexit debate, even as 53% of Britons now support rejoining the EU. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has made it clear, Britain won't be rejoining in his lifetime. Instead, Labour is focused on securing a better trade deal with the EU, rather than reigniting the divisive Brexit battle. While full EU membership remains unlikely in the short term, 63% of Britons favour closer ties with Europe, signalling that the Brexit conversation is far from over. So, was Brexit the own goal of the century? If you ask the millions of Britons struggling with rising costs, weaker trade and broken promises, the answer is becoming increasingly clear. The dream of Brexit has faded, and the reality is setting in. Regret alone won't fix Britain's post-Brexit struggles. While frustration with the outcome is widespread, the bigger question remains: can anything be done to reverse the damage? Let's take a hard look at whether Britain can move forward, and how. Brexit was sold as a promise of control, prosperity, and independence. Instead, it turned into what many now call the greatest own goal of the century. 8 years later, Britain is still struggling with the economic and political consequences, but the real question is, can the damage be undone? The short answer, not completely. But there are ways to soften the blow. While full EU membership remains off the table for now, there's growing momentum for more cooperative relationships. Polls show that the majority of Britons now support rejoining the EU, while even Leave voters are warming up to closer ties. This isn't about reversing Brexit, it's about damage control. Some progress has already been made. The UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA, signed in 2020, laid the groundwork for a new economic relationship. The Windsor Framework in 2023 helped ease tensions over Northern Ireland, and Britain's return to Horizon Europe has reopened vital research and innovation funding. These deals prove that Britain and the EU can work together when politics don't get in the way. But major challenges remain. Trade barriers continue to choke British businesses, pushing up prices and making imports more expensive. Red tape is strangling small companies, and key sectors, like agriculture, are now suffering under high costs and labour shortages. The reality? Brexit backfired, and now Britain needs a way out of the mess. So what's the path forward? More cooperation, fewer ideological battles. Britain must focus on pragmatic solutions that can ease economic pressures and rebuild strategic partnerships. Easing customs barriers and aligning regulations, especially in agriculture, could cut costs and revive struggling businesses. Restoring student exchange programs like Erasmus and recognizing EU professional qualifications would unlock opportunities for young workers, making it easier for talent to move across borders. Strengthening military and intelligence ties, particularly in Ukraine and European defense, would reinforce the UK's global standing at a time of growing geopolitical uncertainty. Meanwhile, aligning carbon regulations could position Britain and the EU as leaders in green energy, benefiting both economies while tackling climate challenges. None of these steps require reversing Brexit, but they demand a shift from political posturing to practical, forward-thinking collaboration. Brexit was a gamble that backfired spectacularly. Now the UK has a choice: double down on failure or start fixing what's broken. What path will Britain take?